Jason Carter walked into the airport with a relaxed smile. He loved flying, but today, he was just a passenger. He had been a commercial pilot for over 10 years, flying some of the biggest planes in the world. But today, he was taking a break and traveling like everyone else. As he approached the boarding gate, he noticed the flight attendants greeting passengers with polite smiles. When it was his turn, their smiles faded a little. A woman in a crisp uniform, Sarah, looked at him with mild surprise. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her voice neutral but distant. Jason handed it over without thinking much. He had a business class ticket, and he was used to flying in comfort when not in the cockpit. But when Sarah saw his seat number, she hesitated for a second before forcing a smile. "Right this way," she said, handing him back his pass. Jason walked to his seat and placed his bag in the overhead compartment. The plane was filling up quickly, and he noticed that the flight attendants were more friendly to other passengers, especially those who looked a certain way. As he settled into his seat, an older woman sitting nearby smiled at him. "Long flight ahead," she said. Jason nodded. "Yeah, but I don't mind. I love flying." A few minutes later, Sarah and another flight attendant, Greg, walked down the aisle, checking on passengers. When they reached Jason's row, he politely asked, "Excuse me, could I get a bottle of water?" Sarah barely glanced at him. "We'll serve drinks after takeoff," she said quickly and moved on. Jason noticed that just a few seats ahead, she happily handed a bottle of water to another passenger. He didn't say anything, but the older woman next to him frowned. "They didn't treat you the same," she whispered. Jason simply smiled. "I've seen it before." A few minutes later, another flight attendant, David, passed by. Jason tried again. "Could I get some water?" he asked. David nodded. "Of course, sir. Give me one moment." Sarah, who overheard the conversation, sighed loudly and muttered, "Some people think they own the place just because they got lucky with a seat upgrade." Jason heard her. He chose not to react, but inside, he shook his head. It wasn't the first time someone had judged him without knowing who he was. As the plane taxied onto the runway, Jason leaned back and closed his eyes, ready for a peaceful flight. Little did the crew know that before this flight was over, they would be begging for his help. The plane took off smoothly, climbing high into the sky. Jason Carter looked out of the window, watching the clouds roll by. Flying had always been his passion, and even as a passenger, he admired the beauty of the skies. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, serving drinks and snacks. Jason noticed how polite and friendly they were with other passengers. But when Sarah reached his row, her expression remained stiff. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her tone professional but cold. "Just water, please," Jason replied. Sarah nodded, but instead of handing him a bottle, she moved past him and served the passengers behind him first. Jason waited, thinking she might have just forgotten. But when she returned, she didn't stop at his seat. Jason sighed. He had been flying long enough to recognize this kind of treatment. He wasn't going to make a scene, but he wasn't going to be invisible either. A few minutes later, another flight attendant, Greg, walked by with the drink cart. Jason politely asked again, "Could I get some water?" Greg hesitated for a moment, looking toward Sarah, who was standing near the front of the cabin. Then, almost as if he was afraid to do something wrong, he nodded quickly and handed Jason a bottle. "Here you go, sir." "Thanks," Jason said with a small smile. Sarah, standing nearby, rolled her eyes and muttered, "Unbelievable." Jason raised an eyebrow, but didn't react. Instead, he opened his water bottle and took a sip. He had spent years keeping his cool in stressful situations. This was nothing new to him. The older woman sitting next to him leaned closer. "I saw that," she whispered. Jason smiled. "It's fine. I'm used to it." She frowned. "You shouldn't have to be." Jason appreciated her kindness, but he wasn't here to argue with strangers or prove himself. He just wanted to enjoy his flight in peace. Suddenly, a loud beep echoed through the cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up as the plane shuddered slightly. The pilot's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Jason sat up a little straighter. He had flown through turbulence many times before, but something about the way the plane was shaking felt different. Sarah and Greg hurried back to their seats, looking slightly nervous. Jason could tell something was wrong. Then, without warning, the plane lurched violently, dropping several hundred feet. Passengers screamed, drinks spilled, and overhead compartments rattled. Jason gripped his armrest and took a deep breath. This wasn't just normal turbulence. Something was very, very wrong. The plane continued to shake. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on and off. Jason could feel his heart rate rising, but he remained calm. As a pilot, he had seen turbulence before. However, this wasn't the usual kind of bumping and shaking that happened during a storm. The plane dipped again, and this time, it was more severe. It felt as if they were dropping out of the sky. Passengers screamed, their voices rising in panic. Jason gripped his armrests, trying to keep steady. He felt the pressure in his chest, the same feeling he got when a plane was descending too fast. Sarah rushed down the aisle, her face pale. She was clearly shaken by what was happening, and Jason could see she was struggling to stay focused. She spoke to Greg in a voice that trembled. "We need to get back to the cockpit. Something's wrong." Jason's eyes narrowed. Something was definitely wrong, but it wasn't just the turbulence. There was an unusual lack of communication coming from the cockpit. Greg was quick to follow Sarah toward the front of the plane, but Jason didn't follow them. Instead, he stayed in his seat, observing the situation carefully. He had no doubt that something was off. This wasn't just about a bumpy ride. It felt like a serious mechanical issue. The plane jerked again, this time so violently that the entire cabin gasped in fear. Jason's calmness remained, but inside, his mind raced. He watched the flight attendants, who were frantically trying to calm passengers, but none of them seemed to know what to do. The cabin felt chaotic, with people looking to the front, expecting reassurance. Jason knew that waiting for instructions wasn't enough. They needed someone who understood the problem, someone who could think clearly and act. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit was hidden behind a closed door. He stood up, glancing at the crew. "I'm a pilot, too," he said to Greg, who was still standing in the aisle, his eyes wide with fear. Greg blinked, not sure what to make of the statement. "A pilot?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jason nodded. "Yes, I'm Captain Jason Carter, and I think we're facing more than just turbulence." For a brief moment, Greg hesitated. The thought of letting a passenger take control was strange, especially with the way things were spiraling out of control. But Greg saw the seriousness in Jason's eyes. "I'll call for help," Greg said, turning to walk back to the front. But before he could move further, Sarah rushed back to them. "What's happening?" she asked, looking frantic. Jason met her eyes. "We're in trouble. I need to get to the cockpit now." Sarah stared at him for a moment. She looked skeptical, but knew the situation was too dire to question. Without another word, Jason walked past her, heading straight to the cockpit door. The flight attendants, now on edge, watched in silence. There was no time to waste. Jason stood in front of the cockpit door. His hands were steady, but inside, his mind raced. He had always been in control of a plane, but this was different. This wasn't his flight, and these weren't his crew. Still, he had the skills, and he couldn't just sit back while the situation got worse. He knocked sharply on the cockpit door, but there was no response. His patience was running out. He had already seen the warning signs. There was something seriously wrong with the aircraft, and the crew was panicking instead of taking action. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, it was chaos. The cockpit was filled with warning lights and sounds. The co-pilot was standing by the controls, sweat dripping from his face. The captain was slumped in his seat, clearly unconscious. Jason's stomach twisted as he realized the full extent of the problem. "Hey, what's going on?" Jason called to the co-pilot, who turned around, startled. I don't know," the co-pilot stammered. "We've lost control of the stabilizers. The plane is." The plane lurched again, and the co-pilot grabbed onto the controls. Jason could feel the nose of the plane beginning to dip again. The descent was far too fast, and the emergency alarms blared louder, causing the co-pilot to panic even more. Jason quickly took a step forward, calmly assessing the situation. He could see the controls were malfunctioning, the autopilot was failing, and the plane's pitch control was erratic. It was clear that they were in danger of losing altitude quickly. "I've got this," Jason said firmly, stepping closer to the co-pilot. The co-pilot looked at him with wide eyes, clearly unsure of what was happening. "What do you mean? You're just a passenger." Jason didn't have time to explain. He took the co-pilot's hands off the controls and smoothly took over. He adjusted the thrust and carefully recalibrated the settings to steady the plane's descent. The emergency warning lights flashed wildly. But Jason remained focused, his hands moving automatically as he worked. The co-pilot watched in awe, realizing that this was no ordinary passenger. Jason's calmness in the midst of this chaos was something he had never seen before. "You're a pilot?" the co-pilot asked, still struggling to catch his breath. Jason didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to the controls and spoke into the radio. "This is Captain Jason Carter. I'm taking control of the aircraft, requesting immediate assistance from air traffic control." The voice on the other end came through loud and clear. "Captain Carter, we copy. We're here. Stay with us." Jason nodded, speaking briefly with air traffic control as he began making small but precise adjustments to stabilize the aircraft. The plane slowly began to level out, and the shaking subsided. In the back of the plane, the passengers were still terrified, but the panic was starting to die down. Jason's voice over the intercom was calm and reassuring as he spoke to them. "We're experiencing some technical difficulties, but we're working on it. Please remain seated and stay calm." The flight attendants, including Sarah, looked toward the front of the plane. They were stunned. The plane was finally steady again, but the tension in the cockpit remained thick. Jason kept his hands firmly on the controls, watching the instruments carefully. The emergency alarms were still blaring, but the plane was no longer plummeting. Jason had regained control, and the immediate danger had passed, but they weren't out of trouble yet. The co-pilot, still in shock, took a step back and sat down in the co-pilot's seat. He glanced at Jason with wide eyes. "How did you do that?" Jason didn't look up as he adjusted the throttles. "I've been flying for years. I know what to do in situations like this." For a moment, the co-pilot just stared at him, his mouth open. "You're a pilot?" Jason finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes, I'm a commercial pilot, just like your captain." The co-pilot's eyes widened even further. "What?" He blinked several times as if trying to make sense of what Jason had just said. "You're a pilot, and you're just sitting back there, acting like a regular passenger." Jason nodded. "I wasn't here to fly the plane. I'm just on a break." But when things started going wrong, I couldn't sit there and do nothing. The co-pilot was still processing the information. He had been panicked, but now he seemed to be in awe of Jason's calmness and confidence. "But why didn't you say anything sooner?" Jason's expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "I didn't want to cause a scene, but when the plane started to drop, I knew I had to act." The radio crackled, and a voice came through, air traffic control checking in. "Captain Carter, we've got your back. What's your current situation?" Jason responded quickly, his voice steady. "I've stabilized the plane, but we need to address the mechanical issues. I'm going to request an emergency landing as soon as we're able to." The air traffic controller acknowledged the request. "Roger that. We'll prepare for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Keep us posted on your status." Jason pressed the intercom button and spoke to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are in control now. We will be making an emergency landing soon. Please remain calm and stay seated." Sarah, who had been hovering near the back of the cockpit, now stepped forward. She had heard Jason's announcement and was clearly struggling with the situation. She stood silently for a moment before speaking. "You're a pilot too?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jason gave her a small nod. "Yes, I am, and I'm here to get us through this." Sarah's eyes softened a little. She had been skeptical of Jason, assuming he was just another passenger without a clue. But now, standing in front of her was a man who had just saved them all. She took a deep breath, realizing that Jason was the reason they were still flying. "Thank you." Jason gave a simple nod. "No need for thanks. I'm just doing my job." The plane was still flying smoothly now, but the emergency wasn't over yet. Jason kept his eyes on the instruments, making small adjustments to ensure they stayed on course. The co-pilot, still shaking from the earlier panic, was watching him in awe, trying to process what had just happened. "Are you sure you've got this?" the co-pilot asked, his voice a little shaky, but with a hint of respect now. Jason nodded, his expression calm. "We're not out of danger yet. We need to land soon, and I'll need your help when we get there." The co-pilot hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Of course, Captain." The communication system buzzed again, and Jason quickly picked up the headset. The voice on the other end was from air traffic control. "Captain Carter, we've identified a nearby airport for an emergency landing. The weather is clear, and we've got emergency services standing by. How are you holding up?" "We're good for now. Just a few more adjustments, and I'll be ready for the approach," Jason replied. He sounded confident, but inside, his mind was working fast. They had to land this plane smoothly, or the situation could quickly escalate again. As Jason communicated with air traffic control, the flight attendants, including Sarah, stood behind him in silence. They could sense the urgency in the air, but they also knew they had a professional in control. Sarah spoke quietly, almost to herself, but Jason could hear it. "I didn't think. I never would have guessed." Jason didn't look back at her. Most people don't. But right now, the most important thing is that we land safely. The passengers were still uneasy, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The constant buzz of the emergency lights had softened, and the shaking of the plane had stopped. The crew was working efficiently, now that they knew Jason was in control. Jason checked his altitude and the plane's systems again. Everything seemed stable, but he was well aware that things could change at any moment. He needed to focus and make sure that the landing was as smooth as possible. "We'll be approaching the runway soon. Everyone needs to stay seated and stay calm." Jason spoke clearly into the intercom, his voice strong but reassuring. The passengers' nervous chatter quieted, replaced by the soft hum of the engines as Jason guided the plane toward the runway. He checked the weather radar again. It was clear, and the runway was long enough for a safe landing. But there was still one big issue. The plane's brakes weren't functioning at full capacity, and the emergency landing would need to be careful and precise. Sarah, standing behind him, saw the look of concentration on Jason's face. "What can we do to help?" Jason's voice was calm. "Just make sure everyone stays in their seats and remains calm. I'll do the rest." The passengers, now fully aware of what was happening, followed the instructions without hesitation. The plane began its descent, and Jason adjusted the controls with steady hands. "We're almost there," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The plane sank lower into the sky, and Jason's eyes remained focused on the runway ahead. It was time to bring this plane home. The plane's descent continued, and Jason's concentration was unshakable. Every second felt like an eternity, but his hands moved with precision, guiding the aircraft lower and lower toward the runway. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of the engines and the occasional clicking of the instruments. Jason glanced over at the co-pilot, who was still sitting in his seat, eyes wide and staring at the controls. "Ready for the approach?" Jason asked, his voice calm but firm. The co-pilot nodded quickly, his hands still shaking. "Yes, Captain." Jason turned his attention back to the runway, focusing on the approach. The airport was just ahead, and the lights of the runway illuminated the night sky like a beacon. The air traffic controller's voice came through the radio, guiding him in. "You're cleared for approach, Captain Carter. Winds are calm. You're on the right course." Jason nodded, more to himself than to anyone else. "Copy that." The plane was getting closer, and the ground loomed large below them. Jason adjusted the speed, carefully bringing the plane in at a safe but swift descent. The landing gear was in place, and the runway was getting nearer with each passing second. Inside the cabin, the passengers had remained quiet, but the tension was palpable. Sarah, Greg, and the rest of the crew stood near the cockpit door, watching the monitors, their faces full of concern. They had seen Jason work his magic from the moment he had taken control. His calm leadership had given them hope. As the plane neared the runway, Jason's hands gripped the controls with even more intensity. The brakes were still a concern, but he had to focus on getting the plane down gently first. "Brace for landing, everyone." Jason's voice came over the intercom. "Keep your seatbelts fastened and remain calm." The crew scrambled to their positions, making sure everyone was following the instructions. They could feel the plane nearing the ground, and the anticipation in the cabin was almost unbearable. "Steady, steady," Jason muttered to himself as he carefully adjusted the pitch of the plane. The wheels were getting closer to the tarmac. The landing was going to be a tight one, but Jason knew he had one shot at this. Finally, with a soft thud, the plane's wheels touched the runway. Jason's hands moved quickly, adjusting the throttle to slow the plane down. The brakes engaged, and the plane began to roll smoothly down the runway. Sarah, standing just behind the cockpit, let out a quiet breath, relief washing over her. She had been holding her breath since Jason had taken control, but now the plane was safe on the ground. Jason didn't relax yet. He had to make sure the plane stopped completely before anything else. Slowly, the aircraft came to a stop, the runway lights flickering as they rolled to a safe halt. The cabin erupted in applause, but Jason kept his focus until the plane was fully still. Only then did he exhale deeply, feeling the weight of the situation lift off his shoulders. "We've made it," Jason said quietly, as he looked around at the co-pilot and the rest of the crew. "We're safe." The crew stood in silence, their faces full of gratitude and disbelief. They had been saved by someone they had dismissed as just another passenger. Now, they knew the truth. Jason was a hero. The plane had finally come to a complete stop on the runway, and the silence in the cabin was almost deafening. Passengers who had been nervously clutching their armrests began to stir, looking at each other in disbelief. Some were still frozen in place, while others were slowly starting to smile with relief. Jason, who had remained calm and collected throughout the entire crisis, sat back in his seat for the first time in what felt like hours. His hands, still gripping the controls, were starting to relax, but his mind was already working through the next steps. The flight attendants were the first to make their way down the aisle, checking on the passengers. Sarah, the flight attendant who had been so dismissive of Jason earlier, was now walking toward him with a look of humility and respect in her eyes. You did it, Captain Carter. You really saved us all," she said softly, her voice shaking. Jason looked at her with a small nod, just doing what needed to be done. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had been skeptical of Jason at first, judging him based on his appearance and assuming he was just another passenger. But now, seeing the way he had handled the emergency with ease and expertise, she felt ashamed of her earlier judgment. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I never thought." Jason gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay. Just remember, Not everyone is who they seem at first. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were still full of gratitude. She turned to walk down the aisle, but Jason's words stayed with her. She would never make that mistake again. Meanwhile, the other flight attendants were moving quickly, directing the passengers to disembark safely. The emergency response team was already on the runway, ready to assist. As the doors of the plane opened, fire trucks, ambulances, and other emergency vehicles lined up, prepared for any further needs. Jason remained in his seat for a moment longer, watching the scene unfold. The plane had landed without incident, and everyone was safe. He took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The co-pilot, still in disbelief, stood beside Jason. "I don't know how to thank you, Captain. That was incredible." Jason shrugged, looking out the window. "You would have done the same if you had the chance." The co-pilot paused, then laughed nervously. "I don't know if I could have kept my cool like you did." Jason smiled. "It's not about keeping cool. It's about knowing what to do. That's what makes a good pilot." The passengers were now making their way off the plane, still talking about the miracle landing and how they had been saved. Jason couldn't help but overhear bits of conversation. "Did you see how calm he was? He was like a pro. I thought we were done for. But then he took over, and everything changed." Jason smiled to himself. He didn't need the praise, but he couldn't deny that hearing the passengers talk about him like that was a good feeling. He had done his job, and now they were all safe. As Jason walked down the jet bridge and out into the terminal, he felt a sense of pride. Not because of the praise, but because he had done something important. He had saved lives, and in that moment, nothing felt better than that. The airport was bustling with activity as passengers stepped off the plane, some still shaking, some smiling with relief. Jason stood off to the side, watching the emergency vehicles move around the aircraft, making sure everything was handled properly. The tension that had filled the air during the flight was now slowly fading, replaced by a quiet sense of calm. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Sarah and Greg approached him, their faces showing a mix of awe and guilt. They had been part of the flight crew, yet they had nearly failed the passengers by not recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Now, they stood before the man who had saved them all. Sarah was the first to speak. "Captain Carter, I don't know how to thank you." Jason looked at her kindly, but didn't say anything at first. His calm demeanor had never been about seeking praise. It had simply been about doing what needed to be done in the moment. "I'm just glad everyone's safe," he replied simply. Greg, standing next to Sarah, nodded. "You were amazing up there. You took control, and we would have been lost without you." He paused and then added, "I've never seen anything like it." Jason smiled slightly. It wasn't magic. It was just training and experience. But Sarah shook her head. No, it was more than that. She looked down for a moment, thinking about her earlier actions. "I didn't see you for who you were. I judged you. I thought you were just another passenger. And I was wrong." Jason's expression softened. "We all make mistakes. It's what we do after that matters." He gave them both a reassuring smile. "Today we learned something important. Don't judge someone by their appearance or by what you think you know." The two flight attendants exchanged glances. They had learned that lesson the hard way. They had judged Jason based on his looks, not knowing that he was a skilled pilot, but they were determined not to make the same mistake again. "Thank you, Captain," Greg said, his voice sincere. "I'll never forget what you did for us today." Sarah nodded. "Neither will I. I'll never treat people the same way again." Jason gave a small nod, acknowledging their words, but he didn't want the attention. "You did your best today. We all did. That's what matters." As Jason walked toward the exit of the airport, he overheard some of the passengers talking to the news reporters. They were telling the story of the emergency landing and how Jason had taken control of the situation. He could hear people praising his calmness, his ability to act under pressure. But Jason didn't need the spotlight. He had done his job, and that was enough for him. As he stepped outside the terminal and into the cool night air, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because he had received praise, but because he had made a difference. He had saved lives, and that was something that couldn't be taken away. Jason had learned long ago that being a pilot wasn't just about flying a plane. It was about staying calm when things went wrong, being ready for the unexpected, and always thinking ahead. And today, he had done just that. As he walked toward his car, Jason's thoughts drifted. He knew that the lessons from today would stay with him, just as the flight attendants and passengers would remember the man who had saved them, the man they never expected to be the hero.